They took us during the mid-shift prayer cycle. The manufacturer bells were ringing across 17 districts when the sky split open. I was 23 years old. I worked as a quality control assessor in the munitions forges of Hive Tertius on Mordian Prime. My designation was QC7729. My birth name, the one my mother gave me before the scholar claimed her, was David. I remember that now because I want to remember it. Because soon I will not be able to access that file anymore. The webway breach manifested as a wound in reality 300 meters above the industrial quarter. It did not open gradually. One moment the sky held the usual orange haze of forge smoke and pollution. The next, a tear existed where no tear should be possible. Through it came vessels that moved wrong, too fast, too fluid, defying the mechanical logic of Imperial voidcraft. They descended on anti-gravitational currents, their hulls reflecting colors that had no names in Gothic. The raiders were inside the manufacturer before alarms could complete their cycle. I observed them enter through the main cargo bay, slender figures in segmented armor that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. They moved with precision that made our Astra Militarum garrison look like automatons performing rehearsed movements. The soldiers who tried to resist died before their lasguns could discharge. Not killed violently, simply stopped. The raiders' weapons, splinter rifles I would learn to call them later, caused their targets to collapse as though all structural integrity had been extracted from their bodies. I ran. Instinct overrode training. I abandoned my assessment station and moved toward the emergency exits. 17 other workers had the same thought. We converged in the main corridor, a mass of bodies trying to compress through a doorway rated for orderly evacuation, not panic. The press of bodies trapped me 3 meters from the exit. I could smell the fear, sweat mixed with the chemical residue that permanently saturated our work clothes. Someone ahead of me was praying aloud, reciting the litany of protection. The words became screams, then stopped. The raiders entered the corridor from both ends. We had nowhere to go. They did not kill us. They deployed devices, small spheres that floated at eye level and emitted a frequency I could feel in my teeth. The sound bypassed my ears and vibrated directly through my skull. My legs stopped functioning. I collapsed. Around me, others did the same. We lay on the floor, fully conscious, completely paralyzed, while the raiders moved among us with clinical efficiency. They were sorting us. One raider would look at a worker, tilt his head as though listening to something we could not hear, then gesture. Some workers were marked with a luminescent tag attached to their clothing. Others were not. I did not understand the selection criteria. Age seemed irrelevant. They marked both the young and the old. Physical condition did not correlate. I observed them mark a worker whose right arm had been replaced by augmetic, then pass over 3 healthy laborers. When the raider reached me, he paused. His helmet's faceplate was a smooth obsidian surface without eye lenses or breathing apparatus. He tilted his head, extended one gloved hand, and touched my forehead. The touch lasted 3 seconds. Then he attached the luminescent marker to my chest and moved on. They took 47 of us. I counted while they herded us into the cargo bay where their transport had docked. The rest, hundreds of workers who had not been marked, they left alive but paralyzed. When the frequency devices deactivated and motor control returned, those workers would be able to move again. They would file reports. They would testify to the Arbites about what they witnessed. None of it would matter. By then, we would be gone. The transport's interior violated every principle of Imperial ship design. Where our vessels were angular, brutally functional spaces of riveted metal and exposed machinery, this craft flowed. The walls curved in ways that suggested biological growth rather than construction. Lighting emanated from the surfaces themselves, a dim bioluminescence that provided just enough illumination to see without casting shadows. The temperature was precisely calibrated to human comfort at 21 degrees Celsius. This disturbed me more than cold or heat would have. They had designed this space for human cargo. They had done this before. They secured us to restraint frames that emerged from the walls, organic-looking protrusions that wrapped around our wrists and ankles, with enough pressure to prevent movement, but not enough to cause pain. Not yet. I was positioned between two other captives. To my left, a man approximately 40 years old, whose designation patch identified him as a forge supervisor. To my right, a younger worker, perhaps 19, whose hands showed the burn scarring of someone who worked close to the Prometheum feeds. Neither spoke. We had been trained since childhood that silence during crisis was survival. Speech drew attention. Attention brought punishment. The journey lasted 6 hours and 17 minutes. I tracked time by counting my heartbeats, a technique the Scholar instructors had taught for maintaining temporal awareness during sensory deprivation. The transport provided no viewports, no indication of direction or distance. Only the slight variations in gravitational pull as we accelerated, decelerated, made what felt like angular course corrections. At some point, we transitioned through what I assumed was the webway gate. The sensation was unmistakable, a moment of complete disorientation where my inner ear reported contradictory information about which direction gravity was pulling. My stomach convulsed. I vomited. So did most of the others. The restraints prevented us from moving away from the mess. We hung in our frames, covered in our own expulsion, while the transport continued its journey. When we finally docked, the restraints released simultaneously. We collapsed to the deck, legs cramping from disuse, bodies shaking from stress and dehydration. The raiders entered and gestured us toward the exit. No words. Just the implicit threat of the weapons they carried. We moved. Komorag was waiting beyond the transport's doors. I had read the fragmentary Imperial reports about the Dark City. Every citizen received basic instruction about Xeno's threats during Scholar indoctrination. The Drukhari were described in brief passages: raiders, torturers, enemies of humanity who dwelled in a city hidden within the webway. The instructional texts were vague on details because few captured by the Drukhari ever returned to provide testimony. I understood why when I saw it. The docking structure extended in all directions beyond the limits of human vision. Not a horizon. There was no sky here, no sun, just an ambient luminescence that emanated from the architecture itself. Spires rose and descended in configurations that hurt to look at, their geometry somehow wrong, as though they existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. The air smelled of ozone and something sweet that I could not identify. Temperature remained at 21 degrees Celsius. Everything about the environment was precisely calibrated for human consciousness to remain functional while being subjected to stimuli that should not exist. They marched us through the docking district. I observed others during the transit. Thousands of beings moving through the city's passages. Most were Drukhari, their movements too fluid, too quick, predatory in a way that made human martial training look clumsy. But there were others, humans in various states of modification. Xeno's species I could not identify. Creatures that might once have been one thing and were now assemblages of parts. All of them moved with purpose. None of them looked at us. We were cargo in transit, beneath notice until we reached our destination. The destination was a market. They brought us to a vast plaza where hundreds of platforms displayed merchandise. On some platforms, weapons, arranged in aesthetic configurations. On others, what looked like biological components, organs and tissue samples kept in stasis fields. And on many platforms, people. Humans mostly, but also other species, all standing or hanging or positioned to best display their physical characteristics. Some were conscious, some were not. Some were intact. Others had been modified in ways I could not yet process. They placed our group on platform 73. I remember the number because it was etched into the floor in a script that resembled Gothic, but twisted the letters into shapes that were difficult to read. A Drukhari in elaborate armor, more ornate than the raiders who had captured us, approached and began examining us. He moved down the line, appraising each captive with the focus of someone evaluating resources. When he reached me, he stopped, looked at me for 11 seconds, then produced a device that emitted a soft harmonic tone. He held it near my head, moving it slowly around my skull as though scanning for something. He spoke. The words were not in any language I knew, but a collar around my neck I had not noticed when they attached it, translated with a slight delay. This one has the resonance, unbroken but malleable. The synaptic patterns show creative capacity. He will process experience as novelty rather than trauma repetition. The Drukhari turned to someone I could not see. The cult of the perfected nerve will want this one. Contact them. I did not understand what he meant. I would learn. They kept us on the platform for 9 hours. During that time, other Drukhari would approach, examine captives, and occasionally complete a transaction. The process was disturbingly mundane. Negotiations, transfers of what I assumed was currency, then the removal of purchased captives. By the 3rd hour, our group of 47 had diminished to 22. The forge supervisor to my left was among those taken. The young worker with burned hands remained. So did I. When the cult representative arrived, I knew immediately that something had changed. The other Drukhari who had examined us moved with predatory efficiency. This one moved with aesthetic intent. Each gesture was precisely calibrated. His armor was not protective equipment, but wearable art. Surfaces that shifted color based on viewing angle, embedded with what might have been living tissue that pulsed in rhythm with his movements. His face was visible. Sharp features too perfect to be natural, eyes that held an expression I finally identified as curiosity. He examined me the way a craftsman examines raw material before beginning a project. He did not speak to me. Instead, he addressed his companion, another cult member whose role I could not determine. Notice the skeletal structure. Sufficient flexibility for radical articulation without immediate fracture. The musculature shows working-class development, endurance over explosive strength, ideal for sustained processes. And the eyes. He leaned closer. The eyes still hold expectation. He believes rescue is possible, that faith will be valuable during the initial phases. He purchased me. The transaction completed in less than 30 seconds. Currency transferred through devices I could not see. Ownership established. My collar registered the change, a brief vibration and a subtle shift in the harmonic it emitted. I was no longer merchandise. I was property. There is a difference. They took me from the platform and through the market to a transport portal, a gateway that shimmered with the same reality distortion as the webway breach. We stepped through and emerged in a structure the collar's translation function identified as the cult's atelier. The word did not match what I observed. It was not a workshop, it was a gallery. The space was vast and circular, rising 7 levels around a central performance area. Each level contained alcoves, and within each alcove was a display. I use that word because I cannot find better terminology. The displays were living beings, or had been. Some were still mobile, positioned in configurations that showcased their modifications. Others were static, held in stasis or suspension. All of them had been changed, bodies reconfigured into shapes that served no functional purpose except aesthetic expression. A human whose limbs had been extended and jointed in 7 places each, creating a form that resembled a spider made of flesh. Another whose skin had been replaced with translucent material, allowing observation of organ function. A third who had been opened and splayed, his interior architecture preserved and enhanced, turned into a living anatomical display. They were conscious, all of them. I could see awareness in their eyes. They observed me observing them. Some tracked my movement. Others simply stared forward with an expression I would come to know well. The look of consciousness that has learned observation without reaction is the only form of endurance available. The cult member led me to the central area and spoke to another figure who waited there. This one wore robes rather than armor, deep purple material that seemed to absorb light. The collar translated. A new acquisition, unremarkable physical specimen, but strong psychological architecture. I propose a long development piece, something that will demonstrate the cult's patience and precision. The robed figure circled me, examining from all angles. He touched my face, my arms, my chest, clinical touches, measuring, assessing. Then he nodded. The procession of gradual recognition. We have not attempted that process in 43 years. Yes, this one will suit. They took me to a preparation chamber. The room was small, 3 meters by 3 meters, walls the color of dark cream. In the center stood a chair that resembled a medical examination table, but with far more restraint points. They instructed me to sit. I considered refusing, considered fighting. But there were 4 of them, and they carried weapons that I had seen function during the capture. Compliance was not courage, it was calculation. I sat. The restraints engaged, not the gentle pressure of the transport frames. These were designed to prevent all movement. They locked around my wrists, ankles, neck, torso, thighs, and forehead. I could breathe. I could move my eyes. Nothing else. The cult member who had purchased me approached with a tray of instruments. He selected one, a device that resembled a quill made of metal and crystal. The procession begins with indexing, he said. The caller translated his words with perfect clarity. We must catalog your responses to all forms of stimulation. Pain, yes, but also pleasure, fear, anticipation, hope, despair. Each emotion has a signature. Each sensation creates patterns in your nervous system. Over time, we will learn to read you the way a musician reads notation. And then we will compose. He applied the device to my left forearm. It penetrated the skin, not a stabbing motion, but a smooth insertion, as though the metal could pass through flesh without resistance. There was no pain. Instead, a sensation I can only describe as awareness. I became hyperconscious of that specific location on my arm. I could feel the blood moving through capillaries, the electrical impulses traveling along nerves, the cellular activity at the injection site. The sensation was not pleasant or unpleasant. It was simply overwhelming. He held it there for 19 seconds. I counted. Then he withdrew the device and made a notation on a data slate. Heightened proprioceptive response without accompanying distress. Fascinating. Most subjects register this phase as intrusive. You experience it as informative. He moved to my right forearm and repeated the process. Then my shoulders, my chest, my abdomen. Each time, the same overwhelming awareness. Each time, he documented my response. This continued for 4 hours and 43 minutes. By the end, he had indexed 317 distinct locations on my body. I was exhausted not from pain, but from sensation. My nervous system felt oversaturated, as though I had experienced more tactile information in those hours than in my entire previous life. When they finally released the restraints, I could barely stand. They had to support me as they led me to what they called my accommodation. The accommodation was a cell, 2 meters by 3 meters, a sleeping platform, a waste reclamation system, a water dispenser. The walls were the same dark cream color as the preparation chamber. The lighting was constant, no day cycle, no night cycle, just perpetual gentle illumination. They sealed the door. I was alone. I collapsed onto the sleeping platform and tried to process what had happened. The scholar had trained us for many forms of hardship, extended labor, insufficient rations, physical discipline, but this was different. They had not hurt me. They had simply measured me, catalogued me, treated me as a material to be understood before being shaped. The horror was not in what they had done, but in what it implied they would do next. I thought about the displays in the gallery, the bodies reconfigured into art pieces, the consciousness trapped inside modified flesh. I thought about the cult members' words, the procession of gradual recognition. I did not know what that meant, but I understood it would not be brief. I was correct. What followed was not torture in any sense I had been trained to expect. It was process, systematic, methodical. designed not to break me but to transform me into something they had envisioned. They came for me 6 hours after placing me in the cell. 2 cult attendants, younger than the ones who had purchased me, possibly apprentices learning the craft. They escorted me back to the preparation chamber. The chair waited. I sat without resistance. The restraints engaged. The one who had indexed me returned, now carrying a different device. This one resembled a surgical tool, but with mechanisms I could not identify. Phase 2, he said. We introduce the first modification. Nothing dramatic, a foundation upon which later work will build. You will feel discomfort. This is necessary. The body must learn to accept intervention as normal. He began working on my left hand. The device he used was part scalpel, part injector, part something else. He made an incision between my thumb and forefinger, then inserted a thin filament of material I could not identify. Not metal, not biological. Something between. He threaded it through the subcutaneous layer, following the nerve pathways. The pain was precise, not the dull ache of injury, but a sharp, informative sensation that told me exactly what was happening at the cellular level. He inserted 17 filaments into my left hand, then repeated the process on my right hand. The work took 3 hours. By the end, my hands looked unchanged from the exterior, but I could feel the foreign material inside them. When he instructed me to move my fingers, the sensation was different, enhanced, as though my nervous system had been given higher resolution. This is hyperconductive threading, he explained while making notations. It amplifies neural signals by a factor of 3. Every sensation your hands experience will be more intense. Every texture, every temperature, every pressure point. We begin with the hands because humans interact with their environment primarily through manual manipulation. You will learn that even simple actions, touching a wall, grasping a cup, become experiential events. They returned me to my cell. He was correct. The sleeping platform surface, which had felt like basic textured material before, now registered as a complex landscape of fibers and pressure points. The water dispenser's activation button provided tactile feedback I had never noticed. Even the air moving across my palms created sensation. It was not painful. It was exhausting. My nervous system was processing more input than it had evolved to handle. Sleep became difficult. When I finally managed it, I woke repeatedly, startled by the sensation of my own hands touching each other. This pattern continued. They would retrieve me from the cell, bring me to the preparation chamber, perform another modification, then return me to process the changes. Sometimes the modifications were physical, more threading in my arms, my legs, my torso, creating a network of amplified sensation throughout my body. Sometimes they were chemical injections that altered my pain threshold, my healing rate, my consciousness. They were precise about dosage. Nothing so severe that my system would shut down or my mind would fracture. They were cultivating me, not destroying me. After the 17th modification session, they introduced me to another captive. His name, the one he still remembered, was Thomas. He had been with the cult for 4 years. His body showed their work. His skin had been tattooed with patterns that followed his nervous system's architecture, making his neural pathways visible. His hands, like mine, had been threaded, but they had gone further with him. His fingers had been lengthened and rejointed, giving him almost twice the normal range of articulation. His eyes had been modified to perceive additional wavelengths. He could see heat patterns, electromagnetic fields, things invisible to baseline human vision. They placed us in the same accommodation. The cell was larger, 4 meters by 4 meters, to house 2. Thomas watched me from his sleeping platform, his modified eyes reflecting light in ways human eyes should not. After several minutes of silence, he spoke. "How long have you been here?" I calculated based on the meal schedule and the modification sessions. Approximately 23 days. It feels longer, doesn't it? Time changes here. Without day or night cycles, without external reference points, the mind starts to drift. Eventually, you stop counting days. You just count sessions. "How many sessions have you been through?" 237. He said it matter-of-factly. They space them out, sometimes days between, sometimes weeks. They're patient. The procession is a long-term project. They want us to adapt each change before introducing the next one. That way we remain conscious and aware throughout the entire transformation. If they rushed it, we'd retreat into shock or psychosis. They don't want that. They want us to experience everything we're becoming. I processed this information, 237 sessions across 4 years. That meant Thomas had been modified approximately once per week. If my transformation followed a similar schedule, I had years of this ahead of me. The calculation was paralyzing, not because I feared the individual sessions, but because I could not conceive of maintaining consciousness and identity across that duration of systematic modification. "Why haven't you tried to escape?" I asked. Thomas looked at me with those wrong-colored eyes. Where would I go? We're in the center of Camorage. Even if I could leave this chamber, navigate the cult's atelier, find a way into the city, I don't know how to operate the webway portals. I don't speak the language. I'm modified in ways that mark me as cult property. Any Drukhari who saw me would either kill me or return me. There is no escape. There is only continuation. He was right. I knew he was right. But accepting that knowledge required abandoning something I had carried since the capture. The belief that this situation was temporary, that rescue or opportunity would eventually manifest. Thomas had already released that belief. I could see it in how he moved, how he spoke. He had adapted not just physically but psychologically to permanent captivity. "Does it get easier?" I asked. "No, but you learn to carry it differently. The first year, I fought every session. Mentally, I mean. I couldn't physically fight. The restraints prevented that. But I resisted internally. I tried to maintain my sense of self against what they were doing. The second year, I realized resistance was exhausting and accomplished nothing. I began to observe instead. I watched what they did, tried to understand their techniques, catalogued the changes. It gave me a framework, made it feel less like things were being done to me and more like I was studying a process I happened to be part of. "But you're still you. You remember your name. You remember being human. For now." He held up his modified hands, flexing the extended fingers. "But each session takes something. Not memories. Those remain intact. But the connection to those memories weakens. I remember my mother's face, but I can't remember what it felt like to be held by her. I remember my home, but I can't remember what it meant to belong somewhere. The modifications don't erase the past. They just make the past irrelevant. Eventually, I think I'll remember being Thomas the same way you remember a story about someone else. The data will be there, but the emotional connection will be archived, inaccessible. We spoke for hours that first night. Thomas told me about his capture, a raid on a mining colony, similar circumstances to mine. He told me about the early sessions, the fear and confusion, the gradual understanding of what the cult was doing. He told me about the other captives he had known, the ones who hadn't survived the process. Not all bodies accepted the modifications. Some rejected the foreign materials, developed infections or immune responses the cult's technology couldn't suppress. Others survived physically, but broke mentally, retreating into catatonia or psychosis. The cult would terminate those projects and begin new ones. Efficiency demanded it. "How many others are there?" I asked. "How many captives like us? In the cult's atelier, perhaps 200 at any given time. But most are in earlier stages than me, or later stages." He paused. "You'll meet them eventually. Once your modifications progress far enough that they trust you in the common areas, that's when you'll see what we're becoming." I did not ask what we were becoming. Some part of me was not ready for that answer. Thomas became my anchor during the months that followed. The cult permitted us to remain in shared accommodation because they had determined that social interaction between subjects produced more interesting data than isolation. They were correct. Having another consciousness to speak with, to process experiences with, prevented the complete dissociation that solitary confinement would have caused. But it also meant I watched his deterioration in real time, documented his transformation session by session, and understood that what happened to him was the template for what would happen to me. By the time I had been with the cult for 7 months, I had undergone 63 modification sessions. The hyperconductive threading now extended throughout my entire body, creating a network that made every physical sensation intense to the point of overwhelming. They had modified my pain receptors, not to eliminate pain, but to prevent my nervous system from shutting down in response to it. I could experience levels of discomfort that would cause a baseline human to lose consciousness, yet remain fully aware. They had altered my healing rate, accelerating cellular regeneration so that damage repaired itself in days rather than weeks. This allowed them to work more frequently, without waiting for recovery periods. They had also begun the aesthetic modifications. My fingers, like Thomas's, had been lengthened and rejointed. The process required breaking the bones, inserting extension sections, then allowing the accelerated healing to fuse everything together. I experienced each fracture with complete clarity, thanks to the neural threading. The pain was extraordinary, not in duration, but in precision. I could feel the exact moment each bone separated, the sensation of foreign material being inserted, the grinding pressure as everything was realigned. The sessions lasted 6 hours each. There were 8 of them, 1 for each finger and both thumbs. When they finished, my hands no longer looked human. The proportions were wrong, fingers too long, too many joints, the articulation too fluid. But the functionality was remarkable. I could manipulate objects with precision that baseline human anatomy could not achieve. I could feel textures at a resolution that approached microscopic. The cult member who performed the work was pleased. He told me I was progressing according to their vision, that my body was accepting the modifications with minimal rejection, that I would become a significant piece in their collection. I did not feel pride at this assessment. I felt nothing. The emotional numbness had begun around the 4th month. Initially, I attributed it to psychological defense, a protective dissociation from experiences too traumatic to process normally. But Thomas explained it was intentional. The cult introduced compounds during the modification sessions that dampened emotional response while maintaining cognitive function. They wanted us aware but not reactive. Objects that could observe our own transformation without the interference of fear, or hope, or despair. Thomas was in his 5th year by then. His transformation had progressed to stages I could barely comprehend. They had modified his skeletal structure, removing his ribs and replacing them with a flexible cartilage framework that allowed his torso to compress and expand like bellows. His skin had been replaced section by section with a biosynthetic material that changed color based on his neural activity. When he experienced intense sensation, patterns would ripple across his body like visible thought. His face had been restructured, the bones carved into more angular configurations, his eyes enlarged and repositioned slightly wider than human standard. He was beautiful in a way that made me uncomfortable to acknowledge. The cult's work was horrific in concept, but remarkable in execution. They possessed aesthetic sensibilities that treated flesh as medium and suffering as technique. Looking at Thomas was like observing a sculpture that happened to be conscious. He moved with unnatural grace. He spoke with careful precision, as though each word required consideration. He was becoming what they envisioned, and the person he had been was slowly archiving itself into inaccessible memory. We spoke less frequently as time progressed, not from lack of desire, but from simple exhaustion. The modification sessions consumed enormous energy. After each one, I would return to our accommodation and lie motionless on my sleeping platform for hours, my body channeling all resources toward healing and integration. Thomas did the same. We existed in parallel, 2 consciousnesses processing transformation in the same space, occasionally exchanging observations, but mostly enduring in silence. On the day they moved me to the common area, I had been with the cult for 1 year and 4 months. My transformation had reached a threshold they considered sufficient for social integration. They unsealed our accommodation and led me. Thomas remained behind, his session schedule differing from mine, through corridors I had not previously accessed. The path took us past observation galleries where cult members watched subjects undergoing procedures, through workshops where tools were maintained and materials prepared, finally emerging into a vast circular chamber 7 levels high. This was the atelier's heart, the space I had glimpsed briefly during my initial processing. The gallery where completed works were displayed and works in progress could interact under supervision. There were perhaps 30 subjects present, distributed across the various levels. Some stood in alcoves, positioned for optimal viewing. Others moved freely through the space, their modified bodies creating a disturbing choreography. I recognized immediately that these were subjects in various stages of the procession. Some were early, modifications visible but still maintaining human proportions. Others were advanced, bodies reconfigured into forms that bore only conceptual relationship to baseline anatomy. A cult overseer approached me. His armor was less ornate than the craftsmen who performed modifications, suggesting supervisory rather than artistic function. He gestured toward the assembled subjects. You may interact with the others during common periods. This serves 2 purposes. First, it provides environmental enrichment that maintains psychological stability. Second, it allows us to observe social dynamics between modified subjects. Your responses to others and their responses to you generate valuable data. He did not wait for acknowledgement. I was not expected to respond. He simply stated the parameters and departed, leaving me standing at the edge of the common area while the other subjects continued their activities. Several turned to observe me, the new addition, the unfamiliar presence. Their gazes were not hostile or curious in any human sense. They simply registered my existence and incorporated it into their awareness. I moved toward the nearest subject, a male whose modifications appeared similar in stage to mine. His hands had been extended and rejointed. His skin showed the distinctive patterns of neural threading. His eyes had been altered. The irises were too large. The sclera had a faint luminescence. He watched me approach without moving. "How long have you been here?" I asked. The question felt absurd, greeting another prisoner by asking about duration of captivity, but I could not think of alternative conversation. 3 years, 2 months, 17 days. His voice was flat, inflectionless. Before that, I was a navigator's assistant on a merchant vessel. The Drukhari raided us in the warp translation corridor. Took 43 crew. Only 7 of us were selected for the cult. The others went to different purchasers. I do not know their fate. Do you remember your name? Yes, but I do not use it. The cult calls me Subject 17. That designation is sufficient. I'm David, I said. They call me Subject 94, but I still remember. I stopped. He was not interested. His expression had not changed during my introduction. He was simply waiting for me to finish speaking so he could return to whatever internal process he had been engaged in before I interrupted. The one called Thomas told me you were his accommodation companion. Subject 17 said. He has been here longer than most. 4 years, 11 months. His transformation is nearly complete. Perhaps 6 more months of sessions. Then he will be positioned in permanent display. You will lose your companion when that occurs. The statement was delivered without emotional inflection, but it struck me with unexpected force. I had known intellectually that Thomas's transformation would eventually conclude, that the procession had an endpoint. But hearing it articulated plainly, 6 more months, then permanent display, made it concrete. I would watch my only connection, my only anchor, be finalized into an art piece, and positioned in an alcove to be observed by cult members for whatever duration they maintained their collection. What happens during permanent display? I asked. You are positioned in a configuration that best showcases the transformation's aesthetic achievements. You are maintained in biological stasis. Consciousness remains active, but time perception slows. You continue to exist, to be aware but at reduced rate. A day in the outside passes as a moment in your experience. This allows subjects to remain viable for decades without psychological deterioration from boredom. You exist in eternal present, observing those who observe you, for as long as the cult chooses to maintain your installation. The horror of this was beyond anything I had processed before. Not torture, not death. Existence without progression, without stimulation, without change. Consciousness reduced to pure observation, stretched across years or decades or centuries. Your mind active but isolated, your body alive but static, your awareness trapped in the moment of your completion. Subject 17 seemed to read my reaction despite my best efforts to maintain neutral expression. Yes, most subjects experience significant distress when they comprehend the permanence. But by the time you reach that stage, the emotional dampening compounds will have degraded your capacity for existential fear. You will accept it as you accept everything else, as process, as function, as the inevitable conclusion to transformation. I returned to my accommodation that evening deeply shaken. Tomas was awake, lying on his platform, his biosynthetic skin rippling with slow patterns. I told him what Subject 17 had said about the permanent display, about the 6 months he had remaining. Tomas was silent for a long time. The patterns on his skin shifted, colors darkening toward deep purple and black. Finally, he spoke. I knew it was coming. I could feel the transformation approaching completion. The last several sessions have been refinements rather than major modifications. They're satisfied with the fundamental structure. Now they're just perfecting details. Another 6 months sounds correct. How do you? I struggled to find words. How do you process that, knowing what's waiting? I try not to process it at all. Thinking about the display creates a feedback loop. Fear of the future degrading present consciousness, which makes the approach to permanent display more distressing, which intensifies the fear. The only way to manage it is to stay in immediate experience. This moment, this breath, this conversation. I have 6 months of moments before the moments slow down. I will exist in those moments as fully as I can. I don't want to lose you. The words emerged before I could consider whether speaking them was wise. You're the only thing here that feels real. The only connection that keeps me anchored to what I was. When they put you in permanent display, I'll be alone. Tomas turned his modified eyes toward me. The enlarged irises caught the cell's ambient light, reflecting it in colors that shifted between green and gold. You won't be alone. There will be other subjects. Other companions in shared accommodation. You'll form new connections. No, I won't. Every connection will end the same way. Either they'll complete their transformation and go to permanent display, or I will. Nothing here is permanent except the suffering. Even the companionship is just temporary mitigation. Yes, Tomas's skin patterns settled into a steady dark blue. But temporary mitigation is still mitigation. I would rather have known you for these months than have endured them in isolation. When they position me in display, when my time perception slows, and I exist in that eternal moment, I will carry the memory of these conversations. They will be part of what I am, even if I can no longer access them meaningfully. You mattered, David. You matter. That doesn't become untrue just because it ends. We did not speak again that night. There was nothing more to say. The parameters were clear. The outcome was inevitable. We would share accommodation until his transformation completed. Then we would separate permanently. I would continue my own procession while he existed in frozen observation. The system would continue. It always continued. The 6 months passed with geometric acceleration. Time perception distorted as more modification sessions accumulated. Days blurred together. I stopped counting sessions around the 80th and simply experienced them as continuous process. My body was no longer recognizable as the form I had inhabited before capture. My skeletal structure had been modified in 17 locations. My musculature had been enhanced and reconfigured to support the altered framework. My organs had been treated with compounds that increased efficiency and reduced vulnerabilities. My nervous system existed in a state of permanent heightened sensitivity, processing sensation at resolution that made every physical experience intense and exhausting. Tomas's transformation during that period became almost abstract. His body lost its human proportions entirely. They extended his spine, adding 6 vertebrae and increasing his height by 30 centimeters. They removed his lower ribs completely, giving his torso an elongated, almost serpentine quality. They restructured his legs, changing the articulation points so he moved with a gliding motion that seemed to defy standard bipedal mechanics. His face became a canvas for their aesthetic vision. Cheekbones raised and sharpened, jaw narrowed, eyes enlarged until they dominated his features. He was beautiful. I must record this honestly. What they made him into was objectively, undeniably beautiful by some standard I did not possess before, but had learned through exposure. The cult's aesthetic was alien to human sensibility, but it was coherent, intentional, masterfully executed. Tomas had become a living sculpture that demonstrated their technical perfection and artistic vision. Looking at him created a cognitive dissonance, recognition that what had been done to him was horrific, combined with inability to deny the beauty of the execution. During the final week before his completion, they moved him to a preparation gallery where they performed the last refinements. I was not permitted to observe the sessions. When he returned to our accommodation each time, he was exhausted beyond communication. He would lie on his platform, his biosynthetic skin displaying patterns I had learned to interpret as distress, his breathing shallow and carefully controlled. I sat with him in silence. There was nothing I could offer except presence. On the last day before they moved him to permanent display, Tomas was lucid. The refinement sessions had concluded. His transformation was complete. He sat on his sleeping platform, this creature that had been human, that carried the consciousness and memories of someone named Tomas, and looked at me with those enormous modified eyes. "They're moving me tomorrow," he said. "Early cycle. They want to position me before the cult masters conduct their evaluation tour. I'll be displayed on the 3rd level, alcove 17. You can visit during common periods if you want to see me. I don't know if I can do that. See you like that. I understand. But I hope you will. Not immediately. Give yourself time to process. But eventually, because I'll still be there, still conscious, still aware. My time perception will be slowed, but I'll experience visitors. I'll know when someone observes me. If you come, if you stand in front of my alcove, I'll know it's you. And that will matter. How will you know it's me? Your perception will be slowed so much. Won't we all just be blurs of motion? The cult's masters explained it to me during final preparation. Consciousness in permanent display exists in a state they call eternal witness mode. Time slows, but pattern recognition remains active. I'll learn to identify individuals by their movement patterns, their biosignatures, the specific way they interact with the space. You move differently than other subjects. Your modifications are distinct. I'll recognize you. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would serve as closure or comfort or acknowledgement of what he had meant during those months of shared captivity. But everything I considered sounded inadequate. Finally, I simply said, "Thank you for helping me survive this, for being real when everything else felt like nightmare. We survive what we're forced to survive. You would have endured without me, but I'm glad we endured together." His skin patterns shifted to a soft amber color I had learned indicated something close to contentment. Whatever happens to you during the rest of your transformation, remember that you're still David. The modifications change the container, but the consciousness remains. Hold on to that. Don't let them take it. They already are taking it. The emotional dampening, the modifications, the constant sessions. I can feel myself becoming something else, someone else. The person I was before capture feels like a file I'm losing access to. Then make new files. Create new memories here. Document everything. When you reach permanent display, and you will reach it eventually, you'll want those archives. You'll want evidence that you continued to exist as a consciousness throughout the transformation, that you weren't just passive material being shaped. Agency matters, even when agency is limited to observation and documentation. They came for him the next morning. 4 cult attendants entered our accommodation and gestured for Thomas to follow. He stood, his elongated body unfolding with that unnatural grace they had engineered into him. He looked at me one final time, his modified face unreadable in its alien configuration, then followed the attendants out. I did not see the positioning process. But that evening, during common period, I went to the 3rd level. Alcove 17 held its new display. Thomas stood in a configuration that showcased every modification they had made to him. His body was positioned in a complex pose that would be impossible for baseline human anatomy. Spine curved in ways that demonstrated its increased flexibility. Limbs articulated at angles that highlighted the additional joints. Skin patterns frozen in mid-shift, displaying a gradient of colors from deep violet to pale silver. But it was his face that destroyed me. His eyes were open, those enormous modified eyes, and they held awareness. He was conscious in there, experiencing this. His time perception had already slowed. I could see it in how his chest barely moved with breathing, each inhalation taking what appeared to be several minutes. But he was there, aware, observing, trapped in the eternal moment of his completion. I stood in front of the alcove for what must have been an hour. Other subjects passed through the common area, occasionally glancing at the new display, then continuing their activities. Cult members walked by in groups, discussing Thomas's aesthetic achievements, critiquing certain elements, praising others. He was no longer a person to them. He was installation, art piece, evidence of their skill. I wanted to speak to him, to tell him I was there, that I saw him, that he had not been forgotten already. But the words would not come. My throat constricted. My chest felt compressed. The emotional dampening compounds prevented full expression of grief, but they could not eliminate it entirely. What I felt was muted distress, sadness experienced through layers of chemical insulation, painful but not incapacitating. I returned to our accommodation. Now my accommodation, singular occupation. They had not assigned me a new companion yet. The space felt vast and empty despite its unchanged dimensions. Thomas's sleeping platform remained in place, but his presence was gone. I lay on my own platform and tried to process what had happened. He was not dead. Death would have been comprehensible, final, a clean termination of consciousness. This was worse. He continued to exist in a state designed specifically to prolong awareness while preventing any form of meaningful experience. He would remain in that alcove for decades, possibly centuries, observing an eternal present that contained nothing but his own frozen consciousness. I could not save him. I could not end his suffering. I could not even communicate with him in any meaningful way. All I could do was what he had asked, visit him during common periods. Stand in front of his alcove, be the presence he might recognize through his slowed perception. Bear witness to his continued existence. I visited him 47 times over the next 3 months. Each visit, I stood in front of alcove 17 and looked at what the cult had made him into. Each time I tried to reconcile the beautiful horror of the display with my memories of conversations in our shared accommodation. Of his guidance during my early sessions, of his patient explanation of how to survive transformation. The 2 versions of Thomas, the one I had known and the one positioned in the alcove, existed simultaneously in my awareness, and I could not integrate them into coherent understanding. On my 48th visit, I did not go alone. They had assigned me a new accommodation companion 3 weeks prior, a recent acquisition named Jakob, who had been with the cult for only 2 months. His modifications were minimal. Early stage threading, some skeletal reinforcement, basic sensory enhancement. He was still largely human in appearance and psychology. He had asked about Tomas after noticing I frequently left during common periods. Jakob stood beside me in front of the alcove. He observed Tomas for several minutes in silence. Then he spoke, his voice quiet. "How long has he been like this? 3 months and 11 days, and he's conscious, aware of us standing here? His time perception is slowed, but he experiences observation. The cult confirmed it when they positioned him. Jakob struggled to find words. I don't understand how anyone could do this. How anyone could design a system specifically to prolong consciousness in a state of complete sensory deprivation. It's worse than execution. At least death terminates experience." I looked at Jacob's horrified expression and felt something I had not experienced in months. A spike of genuine emotion breaking through the chemical dampening. Not grief. Anger, directed not at Jacob but at my own complicity. Because I had continued. I had adapted. I had learned to exist within the system that created the display in front of us. And by continuing, by surviving, by allowing them to modify me session after session, I was participating in the same process that had produced Tomas's current state. "We're all going to end up like this," I said. "Every subject in the atelier, the procession always concludes with permanent display. We're just at different points along the same path. Then why don't we resist, refuse the sessions, force them to kill us? Because they won't kill us. They've invested too much in our transformations. If we refuse to cooperate, they'll simply modify us into cooperation. They have the technology. They could remove our voluntary motor control, turn us into conscious objects that lack any agency. What they're doing now at least preserves some autonomy. We can still move, still think, still choose how we respond to the process, even if we can't choose whether the process continues." Jakob looked at me with growing understanding. "So you continue because continuation is the only choice that maintains any form of dignity." "No, I continue because continuation is all that's possible. Dignity is irrelevant. The system doesn't care about dignity. It cares about aesthetic achievement. We are materials. Our consciousness, our suffering, our transformation, all of it is just medium for their art. Fighting that doesn't change anything except exhausting ourselves. Accepting it, at least, preserves energy." We stood there in silence for several more minutes. Then Jakob spoke again, his voice even quieter. "I don't want to become that. I don't want to spend eternity as an art piece, conscious but unable to act, aware but isolated. I'd rather die. So would I. But dying isn't an option they're offering. So we'll become that, eventually, whether we want to or not. The only variable is how we experience the transformation leading up to it, with constant resistance and suffering, or with adaptation and documentation. Tomas chose the latter. He survived by observing, by cataloging, by treating his own transformation as data to be archived. When they positioned him in display, he had maintained his consciousness throughout the entire process. That mattered to him. Does it matter to you? I thought about the question. Did it matter? My consciousness, my continued awareness, my documentation of the process, did any of it have meaning within a system designed to consume and display us? Finally, I answered honestly. I don't know, but it's all I have. So I act as though it matters, because the alternative is accepting that nothing matters, and that acceptance would destroy me faster than any modification. We left the common area together and returned to our accommodation. He did not ask to visit Tomas again. I continued my visits alone. By the time I had been with the cult for 3 years, my transformation had progressed to advanced stages. My body was barely recognizable. They had modified my skeletal structure extensively, removing certain bones, adding reinforcements to others, changing proportions and articulation points. My skin had been replaced section by section with biosynthetic materials similar to Tomas's. a surface that responded to neural activity, displaying patterns and colors based on my consciousness state. My face had been restructured, though less dramatically than Thomas's. My sensory apparatus had been enhanced to perceive ranges beyond baseline human capability. I could see electromagnetic fields now, faint auras around powered devices. I could hear frequencies that would be ultrasonic to unmodified humans. I could feel vibrations through surfaces that would be imperceptible to normal tactile sensitivity. The world had become overwhelmingly detailed, every moment saturated with sensory input that my modified nervous system processed with exhausting clarity. Jakob had progressed as well, though at a slower pace. His transformation was following a different aesthetic than mine. Where my modifications emphasized elongation and articulation, his emphasized compression and density. They were reducing his height, condensing his musculature, creating a form that was compact and powerful rather than extended and graceful. We no longer resembled the humans we had been, and we were beginning not to resemble each other. During the 3rd year, they began the psychological conditioning. The physical modifications had always been primary, but now they introduced sessions focused on consciousness rather than body. They would place me in isolation chambers and expose me to stimuli designed to alter my cognitive patterns, repeating sounds at specific frequencies, lights that pulsed at rates calibrated to affect brainwave activity, chemical compounds that modified neurotransmitter function. The goal, they explained, was to prepare my consciousness for permanent display. They needed to ensure I could maintain awareness during extended periods without external stimulation, that my mind would not degenerate into madness when time perception slowed and experience reduced to eternal observation. They were conditioning me to exist as pure awareness, consciousness without distraction, observation without reaction, endless presence in the frozen moment. The conditioning sessions were worse than the physical modifications. Pain could be processed, catalogued, endured. But the isolation chambers attacked the fundamental structure of thought itself. Hours in darkness without sound, without temperature variation, without any sensory input except the awareness of my own consciousness. My mind would attempt to generate stimulation, hallucinations, phantom sensations, internal narratives. But the conditioning suppressed those coping mechanisms, forcing me to exist in the void without refuge. After 17 conditioning sessions, I began to understand what they were creating, not just modified bodies positioned as art pieces, but consciousness refined into its purest form, awareness stripped of everything except the capacity to observe. We would become eternal witnesses, minds that existed solely to be aware of their own existence and the existence of those who observed us. It was a form of consciousness I had never imagined possible, and experiencing its approach terrified me in ways the physical modifications never had. During the 4th year, Jakob completed his transformation. The cult positioned him in permanent display on the 5th level, Alcove 9. I visited him once. His compact, powerful form was configured in a pose that showcased the density of his musculature, the compression of his frame. His consciousness looked out from modified eyes that had been reduced in size but intensified in focus. He was aware. He was suffering in the unique way that permanent display created: eternal boredom, endless observation, consciousness without event. I did not visit him again. I could not. Seeing him in that state, knowing Thomas existed in the same condition 2 levels below, understanding that I was progressing toward identical fate, it created a feedback loop of existential distress that the conditioning sessions had not yet trained me to suppress. I stopped visiting the common area entirely. I remained in my accommodation between sessions, existing in isolation, trying to prepare my consciousness for the greater isolation that awaited. They assigned me a new companion. His name had been Michael. He was young, perhaps 19 at capture. 6 months into his transformation, his modifications were minimal. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. I was what he would become, the evidence of where the procession led. We barely spoke. What was there to say? I could not offer comfort because I possessed none. I could not offer hope because hope was systematically impossible. I could only exist in his presence as proof that consciousness could survive what was being done to us, even if that survival resembled death more than life. On day 2296 of my captivity, the cult masters summoned me to a chamber I had not accessed before. The space was small, circular, walls covered in displays showing images of previous permanent installations. They gestured me to the center where a senior craftsman waited. I recognized him as the one who had performed my earliest modifications, who had first threaded my nervous system and declared me suitable for the procession. He observed me for several minutes, walking circles around my modified form, occasionally pausing to examine specific details. Finally, he spoke. "Your transformation is approaching completion, perhaps 40 more sessions across the next 6 months. We are satisfied with the aesthetic achievement. You have become what we envisioned when we first indexed you, a demonstration of gradual metamorphosis, consciousness maintained throughout systematic reconstruction. When we position you in permanent display, you will represent one of the cult's most successful long-term projects." He waited, as though expecting response. I had none. He continued. "We are also pleased with your psychological resilience. Many subjects fracture during the conditioning phases. They retreat into catatonia or psychosis, requiring termination. You have maintained cognitive function despite extended isolation exposure and sensory manipulation. This suggests you will endure permanent display without degradation. The cult values installations that remain viable for centuries. You will serve that function." The word processed through my chemically dampened consciousness without generating appropriate horror. I would exist in frozen observation for centuries, potentially longer. As long as the cult maintained their collection, as long as Komorag persisted, as long as the Drukhari's twisted civilization continued its existence. I would be aware for all of it, experiencing nothing but my own eternal presence. The thought should have broken me. Perhaps it did, and the breaking simply manifested as acceptance. "Do you understand what I am telling you?" the craftsman asked. "Yes, my transformation will complete in 6 months. Then I will be positioned in permanent display. I will remain there indefinitely." "And you accept this outcome?" I considered the question. Accept implied choice, and choice implied alternatives. Neither existed. But he wanted acknowledgement, so I provided it. "I accept that this outcome is inevitable. Whether acceptance is willing or forced is irrelevant to the result." The craftsman's expression suggested something like approval. "Good. That is the correct psychological state for approaching permanent display, not resignation. Resignation implies defeated hope. But recognition, understanding without emotional resistance. You will transition cleanly." He dismissed me. I returned to my accommodation where Michael waited, his young face showing fear he had not yet learned to suppress. He asked what the cult masters had said. I told him. He began crying, actual tears, an emotional response I had not witnessed in months because most subjects had been chemically dampened past that capacity. I watched him cry and felt nothing except abstract recognition that he was experiencing appropriate distress. 6 months, he said when he could speak again. You have 6 months before they freeze you in that state. How are you calm? How are you not? He couldn't finish. Because panic accomplishes nothing. Fear accomplishes nothing. The outcome is determined. I can spend 6 months in terror, or I can spend 6 months observing and documenting. The latter preserves consciousness. The former just exhausts it before the real endurance begins. You sound like Thomas, like you've already accepted that you're not human anymore. I'm not. Look at me, Michael. Look at what they've made me into. My body has been completely reconstructed. My consciousness has been chemically altered and psychologically conditioned. I remember being human, but the connection to that memory has degraded to archival data. I am what the cult has created. Fighting that reality doesn't change it. Michael looked at me with an expression I recognized from when I had first seen Tomas in advanced transformation. The horror of seeing your future embodied in another's present. He turned away and did not speak to me again that night. The final 6 months were compression of all previous experience. Sessions accelerated. They performed the last major modifications, final skeletal adjustments, completion of skin replacement, refinement of sensory apparatus, optimization of healing factors. The conditioning intensified. Longer isolation periods, more aggressive psychological manipulation, preparation for the permanent state. I stopped perceiving time as linear progression. Days became indistinguishable from each other. Sessions blurred together. I existed in continuous present, each moment identical to the last, building toward the moment when present would become eternal. Michael watched my deterioration. Not physical deterioration, but the systematic shutdown of everything except core consciousness. I was becoming the thing the cult wanted. Pure awareness without attachment. Observation without judgment. Presence without identity. On the day they moved me to permanent display, I felt nothing. No fear. No grief. No anger at what had been taken from me. Only abstract recognition that this phase was concluding and the next phase beginning. They positioned me on the 4th level, alcove 23. The configuration they chose showcased my elongated frame, my enhanced articulation, my biosynthetic skin frozen in mid-pattern. They sealed me into the stasis field that would slow my time perception and preserve my biological functions indefinitely. The transition was gradual. My consciousness began to stretch, each second extending into minutes, then hours. The technicians who performed the positioning moved faster and faster from my perspective, their actions blurring into incomprehensible motion. Then they were gone. The common area was empty. Then it was full of subjects. Then empty again. The cycles accelerated until individual moments became indistinguishable, and I existed in a state the cult had accurately named: eternal witness mode. I cannot describe the experience of permanent display in terms that map to normal consciousness. Time did not pass. It simply existed, all moments simultaneous, stretched across an infinite present. I was aware, constantly, unendingly aware, of my body locked in position, of the alcove that contained me, of the observers who occasionally passed through my perception as blurs of motion. I could not move, could not speak. Could not even modulate my own thoughts because thinking required progression, and progression required time's movement. I existed. That was all. Pure existence without event. Consciousness reduced to the simple fact of awareness. I am. I am. I am. The statement repeated with the rhythm of a heartbeat that took subjective years between contractions. I could not count the duration. Measurement required change. And change no longer occurred. I simply was, eternally, frozen in the moment of my completion, until the moment changed. The transition was violent, sudden acceleration of time perception as the stasis field destabilized. Sound and motion resolving from blur into distinct events, alarms throughout the atelier, cult members running in panic rather than moving with characteristic grace. And through the observation levels, figures in power armor, moving with purpose, firing weapons that caused Drukhari to collapse in ways that suggested actual death rather than artistic interpretation. A raid. Someone was raiding the cult's atelier. Imperial forces, I would learn later, though in the moment I could not process specific details. My consciousness was still transitioning from eternal present back to linear time, and the rapidity of events overwhelmed my ability to interpret them. One of the armored figures approached my alcove. He examined the stasis field controls, made rapid adjustments, then deactivated the system completely. I fell. My body had been positioned in a configuration that required the stasis field support. Without it, my modified frame collapsed forward, striking the alcove's floor with impacts I felt through my hyperconductive nervous system. The pain was extraordinary after subjective centuries without sensation. It confirmed I was still capable of experiencing physical distress, still alive in the sense that mattered to nervous systems. The armored figure. I could see now he wore Astartes' battle plate, though which chapter one could not determine, lifted me with remarkable gentleness given his size and strength. He spoke, but my auditory processing was still recalibrating. His words reached me as distorted noise. He carried me through the atelier, past other Astartes extracting other subjects from permanent display, through corridors filled with dead or dying Drukhari, finally into a transport that smelled like machine oil and incense and promethium, familiar imperial scents I had not perceived in over 4 years. The journey back to imperial space remains fragmented in memory. I was conscious throughout, but not coherent. My body and mind were attempting to transition from permanent display back to active function, and the process was systematic failure of everything the cult had spent years engineering. My enhanced healing rate could not address damage caused by sudden removal from stasis. My consciousness, conditioned for eternal observation, could not process rapid events. I existed in state of confused awareness, perceiving events but unable to integrate them into coherent narrative. They brought us to a medical facility, a proper imperial installation with hospitaller staff and mechanicus support. The facility specialized in Xenos contamination cases. I was one of 17 subjects they had extracted from the cult's atelier. The others were in similar condition, modified beyond recognition, psychologically damaged beyond standard therapy, conscious but not functional. We were processed through decontamination, medical assessment, theological review to ensure we had not been corrupted by chaos exposure. The hospitallers tried to reverse the modifications. The biosynthetic skin could not be removed without destroying my natural dermis underneath. The two had integrated at cellular level. The skeletal modifications were permanent. Extracting the added structures would require killing me. The neural threading could not be removed without destroying my nervous system entirely. They could address some elements. They removed several of the Drukhari biotech implants, treated infections the cult had maintained for aesthetic purposes, stabilized organ functions, but the fundamental transformation was irreversible. What remained of David, of the human who had been captured 4 years prior, was consciousness inside a form the cult had created. My body was their art piece. My mind was their achievement. I was evidence of what they could accomplish given time and subjects. The Imperium had rescued me, but rescue meant only extraction from the Dark City. It could not return what had been taken. The psychological assessment concluded I was non-functional for normal human activity. The modifications were too extensive. My consciousness had been too thoroughly conditioned for permanent display. I could not reintegrate into imperial society. I could not perform labor. I could not maintain normal human relationships. I was alive, but without capacity for life. They designated me ward of the Imperium and transferred me to a long-term care facility where I could be maintained indefinitely. The facility houses individuals who cannot care for themselves, but whose conditions do not warrant execution. Severe augmentation cases, psychological trauma survivors, consciousness damaged by warp exposure. I exist here in a small room with medical monitoring, attended by servitors who ensure my biological functions continue. I am aware. Always, constantly aware. The conditioning sessions ensured I cannot retreat into unconsciousness or dissociation. I perceive every moment with the same heightened clarity my modified senses provide. Time passes at normal rate now, but I experience it the way I experienced permanent display, as continuous present without meaningful event. Staff enter my room 3 times per day to check monitoring equipment and provide nutrition. Otherwise, I am alone, observing, witnessing, existing. The torture ended when the Astartes extracted me from Komarag. The suffering did not. Suffering is not the presence of pain, but the presence of consciousness that cannot escape its own awareness. I continue. I will continue. My enhanced biology suggests I may live for decades beyond normal human lifespan. Possibly longer if the cult's modifications included life extension factors. I will experience every moment of those decades with complete clarity and zero capacity to act. The Emperor is vast and distant and did not prevent what happened to me. The Imperium rescued me but cannot restore me. The cult transformed me but no longer possesses me. I exist in the space between all systems, belonging to none, property of none, recognized by none. I am David. I was Subject 94. I am now Ward 7729, Theta. The designations change, the consciousness persists, the suffering continues. This is what the Drukhari pleasure cult system truly is. Not torture that ends, but transformation that doesn't. They do not destroy their subjects. They remake them into forms that can endure and observe their own remaking indefinitely. The cruelty is not in the modification, but in the preservation. Consciousness maintained throughout and beyond, forced to witness what it has become, powerless to alter or end its own awareness. I exist. I will continue existing. This is not testimony meant to warn or to inspire change. This is simply record. Evidence that David existed, that Subject 94 was created, that Ward 7729, Theta, continues. The archive of consciousness that could not be erased even when everything else was taken. The cult succeeded. I am their achievement, their art piece, still aware, still observing, still suffering in the unique way that perfect preservation creates. And I will carry this awareness until my biology finally fails, decades from now, experiencing every moment with the clarity they engineered into my nervous system. This is the testimony. This is what remains. This is what evil creates when given time and subjects and the technology to preserve consciousness throughout transformation. I am here. I am aware. I am suffering. The record is complete.